Therapists have read it. What was the moment you realized your client couldn't be helped? On a positive note. I was let go by my therapist because I was better. Was a great moment. Edit. Wow. I'm happy this resonated with people. I should mention, this was a few years ago. I've had ups and downs since then. Recently got out of a down, but I was able to learn to deal with it myself. If you're struggling right now, know your efforts are not in vain. It takes time, it takes work, it takes practice. And even when you're better, you will fall again. It happens, but you'll be better equipped the next time. Stay strong. A family member was dropped by their therapist because of constant lying. Basically, this family member, who is an incredibly toxic individual, played the victim to her therapist and then encouraged him to speak to her adult children, assuming that the therapist would take her side and tell the children how horrible they have been. Needless to say, the therapist got the truth from the children and sent a letter stating that they could no longer meet with the family member, going so far as to encourage him to seek inpatient treatment. Edit. It's kind of depressing how many people can relate to this. Stay strong, everyone. I am a therapist for sex offenders. One particular client was a drug user, but thus far it did not seem to interfere with the therapy. It was in no way related to his criminal acts. Until one day he showed up for his appointment completely high on hard drugs. He had already been awake for 48+ hours. Turned out his drug abuse was way worse than he'd make it seem. He also severely damaged his penis while high, he told us. We immediately referred him to a rehab and never heard from him since. My mother switched through a dozen therapists before she found one that blindly supported her delusional perspectives. She will never be helped. When the child is younger than 8-9 years old and the parents want me to only work with the kid to change the kid's behavior. Ain't gonna happen. You change the environment and parenting and then you see changes in the kid's behavior. Don't mind me, just seeing if my therapist posts in this thread. I had a therapist send me a very kindly worded letter that told me she couldn't see me anymore until I found a way to remember appointments and show up. 3 months later I called and said I found a way to remember and I wanted to try again. She took me back and I never missed another appointment. Doing that was crucial. I needed to make therapy a priority for it to help. If I hired a personal trainer but never showed up or never did any exercise, then even the best personal trainer could not help me. A therapist is a personal trainer for the mind. They can't actually fix or do any of the work. They can only suggest work or help their client choose work to do. The client can't be passive. They must do work. The best they can hope for is to live out their days as a ward of the state in a facility where they can be regularly medicated and kept away from society. This girl is smart, very smart, but also she doesn't understand consequences in the least. And one little thing you might say to her like, we can't get a drink of water from the fountain, let's go in here, I will get you a bottle of water, is a justifiable cause in her mind for her to gouge your eyes out with a cafeteria spork and strangle you until you die. My therapist had to let me go because my insurance decided my mental health wasn't worth paying for and I couldn't afford her rate. I miss her sometimes. She was my first therapist and I enjoyed talking with her. Not a therapist. I had read a comment by a therapist on a similar question. And #X200B. Patient A was being diagnosed by the therapist. A was very suicidal and was prescribed to be hospitalized. Later on one day the patient sharing room with a committed suicide and A was suggested to change hospital. Later on therapist Op realized how aware A was of all the facts and was acting to be disturbed. After some background check, therapist found out that A used to befriend his roommate, pal at the mental hospital, convince him to commit suicide with him, let them do it first and not do it himself, and the cycle would continue at the new hospital. He kept hitting on me. I had brought it up for reflection in context of his functioning and history. Lots of attempts to deepen insight and hold a boundary. At some point the boundary needed to get bigger. So I ended our therapeutic relationship. I was let go by a therapist. I was being treated for depression by my university psychologist. In actuality I was bipolar and yet to be diagnosed. I was coping in every possible unhealthy way. Self-harm, alcohol, binging, purging, etc. The university wasn't set up for long-term care, so after a certain number of sessions she had referred me to an outside psychiatrist, but it was a terrible experience and I went back to her. She told me that she couldn't keep seeing me for her own mental health. She had become so concerned for me that it was affecting her. It was incredibly hard to hear. Like, I'm so fucked up I even disturb a professional. But mental health professionals are people too, and I understand why. This happened with my brother. My mom signed him up for much-needed therapy, and he went for about a month or so before coming home very angry one day and saying he was never going back. My mom talked to the therapist, and she couldn't really tell any details for confidentiality reasons, but the gist basically seemed to be that she spent the month listening to him and trying to get him to think about things on a deeper level, and when she finally started outlining things from an outside perspective that didn't align with his, he got very angry with her. He quite literally couldn't handle the truth. They had an advanced extreme case of antisocial personality disorder, too agitated, too aggressive, with substance abuse. After months in therapy at a hospital, there was no progress whatsoever and nothing to be done. Their family didn't want them, neither did the police, nor the hospital, and after setting their bed on fire and harming the other patients, I was just too scared to work with them, so I closed the file and spoke to the doctor to find another solution. Sadly, COVID happened and they had to lay off a huge majority of the staff in the hospital. Since I was still new, I was let go. I still don't know what happened with the patient. My sister was let go by her therapist because she was lying to him constantly. He told my dad the therapy was a waste of money as long as she wasn't prepared to face her issues. It's been about 20 years since then and she is still a train wreck. I consequently started seeing him a few years later for depression and he was wonderful. I didn't want medication, so he didn't recommend starting any, and the CBT was really what I needed to get out of the thought cycle I was in. Once we both felt like I was in a good place and had developed the tools I needed, he let me go. Great guy that really helped me. They lost their insurance. In the end, everyone has to help themselves. You can guide them and offer suggestions and tips, but if they're not going to do the work, and if they're not going to work to let go of the stuff that's holding them back, then there is nothing you can do. Related-ish, the producer on an album I was recording quit after the first day, saying, "This isn't music, it's a cry for help." Turns out, she was right. I usually can tell in the first 2-3 sessions. Mostly narcissistic individuals who are brought to treatment by their significant other or a relative desperately hoping for change. It never works. When I was 12, I saw a therapist with my mother in the room. This 70-year-old therapist started the session with basic questions. One question was, "What is a similarity between an peach and a pear?" My response, "They both start with P." He said he had never heard that answer and that nearly everyone says they're both fruit. Then he ended the session and dropped me. I'm not a therapist, but my mom has a cycle of be bipolar as fuck, get medicated, stop drinking alcohol, life gets infinitely better, decide it's God who healed her and not meds, etc. Start drinking again, and I saw one of her therapists tell her she had done all she could for her. When she committed suicide. It might sound harsh, but she was one of my very first patients as a doctor. Had several sessions with her together with colleagues. She was a very nice person. She will be forever stuck in my mind. I was a therapist for the British Army for a while, and I don't think I ever had a patient who was flat out beyond help. There were a couple that were beyond my help and I had to refer on to specialists, but that's not uncommon in that kind of job. Not every therapist is equipped to deliver every kind of therapy. It's more about being able to recognize when your methods aren't benefiting the patient and a different approach would be more effective for them. There isn't really such a thing in the practice of therapy as someone being a lost cause. My therapist turned me into my superiors, after already being separated from the military, just waiting for my retirement date to kick in, for smoking marijuana and telling her it was one of the best experiences I've had. She told me in the beginning that the only thing she would report is self-harm or violence against other. I learned that day not to trust my therapist, and I don't talk about my drug use, when at raves mostly, to my current therapist because of it. I was let go by my therapist. Spent months with her trying to get me to open up. So I finally decided to, just a little bit, and her face went white, said she couldn't help me. But I was able to help myself. Still am working through it. I worked inpatient psych and had someone come on suicidal on a 72-hour hold. He was very intelligent with a PhD in physics or something. He mentioned he'd do whatever we need and was very polite and sweet. Next day we are chatting and he freaking runs and dives off a filing cabinet. We extended his hold, if I recall, a few days or whatever the law allowed. On his way home he jumped out of the vehicle and dove off a bridge onto a rock. Whole time we had him I assumed he would do the deed after discharge. A client here, I was fired after 3 sessions as my problems were too first world for the counselor. I was dealing with professional burnout and perfectionism, she was focusing on alcoholics and domestic violence victims. A few years ago, my, now ex-wife and I started marriage counseling and individual therapy at the same time. About 6 months later, the clinic stopped all 3 sessions within a week of each other. The marriage counselor said that we were not reaching our goals, so there was no point of continuing. My therapist basically commented that I was fine after getting on meds for depression. Oh boy, was she wrong. My ex-wife claims to have concluded on her own that she was fine, although she told me that her therapist recommended that she continue. My guess is the owner of the clinic basically figured out that my marriage was a complete train wreck and she wanted nothing to do with either